So Vivian,
So Alan,
if it's not too personal of a question, have you ever been on a classic first date?
what in what way?
I think in the way that you meet for dinner with someone that you don't particularly know very well. Maybe a friend set you up, and you're basically meeting someone for the first time on a date.
I don't.
This is going somewhere. This is relevant to religion and popular culture.
Yeah, I don't think I have.
No, I haven't either. Because Toria and I were already dating, so to speak, before we first went out for dinner and things like that. Now, the reason I ask is because I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago on a long journey to Wales called Help I Sexted My Boss. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, it's good fun. It's very amusing. It's something really nice to pass the time to. It was good to drive to. So it's essentially like an agony aunt show that's hosted by two young guys. One of them is, I think he's the world's leading etiquette coach. But he's definitely an etiquette coach. He's very upper class and very well-to-do. And the other host is a bit of a lad. And it's the juxtaposition between the two of them that is the draw of the show. They have really good chemistry. But the nice draw of the show is that they are actually best friends. And they essentially receive emails, tweets, comments from listeners with agony aunt style problems, and they give them advice. So that's why the show is called Help I Sexted My Boss. You know, what do I do in modern embarrassing situations? And we were listening to an episode about first dates, and they said something very interesting. So they had some emails from listeners with some disastrous first date stories, some people oversharing and things like that. And William, the etiquette coach, said, and apparently he's said this a few times because Tori's listened to the podcast more than I have, there are, on first dates, small talk taboo topics. And they are sex, money, health, politics, and religion. And I was immediately struck when I heard this because I thought, wow. So
I was about to say, have you never... Because I have heard that on dates, you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion. I had heard that before. I have never followed it because I obviously, whenever someone's talking to me about what I do, I kind of have to talk about religion.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe my etiquette's really poor, but I would want, for a start, I would want to talk about politics on a first date because I would want to figure someone out politically. Because I wouldn't want to go on 3 or 4 lovely dates with someone and then to find out that they're a Daily Mail reader.
Find out that they're UKIP.
Dreadful. Yeah, exactly. You know, you got to get a feel for someone. But I was struck by religion because like you said, the first thing I thought was, well, what on earth would I talk about? With what we do for a living, we would have to mention it anyway. But putting religion under a list of things that you shouldn't talk about while potentially meeting a life partner, it reminded me of the episode we did with Love is Blind. And what were their names? Lovely Kyle and Shayna?
Yeah. Look at you remembering reality TV.
Lovely Kyle and Shayna. They just weren't meant to be. Well, for any of our listeners who haven't listened to that podcast, that episode, the Love is Blind one, you really should. I really enjoyed that one. But essentially, Shayna in this blind date style show couldn't be with Kyle because he didn't believe in God and religion was so important to her. And Kyle said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, I can't believe that it's religion that stopped us from being together in this day and age, which was a quote that we just unpacked for ages because it said so much about
it. Was that quote that I went, okay, well, now we have to have an episode about this.
Yes, I agree. And that's immediately what sprung to mind for me here, with religion being a taboo topic on a first date. Because it really suggested a mindset about religion being a privatized personal affair. It also really suggested something about secularization as well, that religion isn't important enough to talk about, but is still important enough to be a taboo. So it could still cause rifts between you and the person that you're dating or having a chat with, but at the same time, you still don't mention it because it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
I always found it interesting that the taboos for it were supposed to be things that cause rift. When it's like, that kind of be the point. Like, you want to have something that either makes it work or it doesn't work, like, immediately. But maybe, I don't know, maybe it's because I really hate dating. So for me, it was like anything that gets this either finished one way or the other as fast as possible will make me happy.
Yeah, I've never been on a first date. Maybe, it looks like we're both not well placed to do this. Maybe one of our listeners who has been on a first date could share an experience with us about whether religion came up or not.
Tweet us at RPC_pod with your stories. That would be amazing.
Tell us about your first dates and if religion played a part in it. But I completely agree with you. When you go on a first date, you're essentially feeling someone out, aren't you? Yeah. In a metaphorical sense, you are in a spiritual seeing sense, whether you're. Say. Yeah. So, you could see whether you're compatible, like, we both like Taylor Swift. Cool. But at the same time, your love of Taylor Swift may not sustain your relationship if 6 dates down the line, you find out that you're dating a conservative evangelical and you're a liberal Quaker, say. So, things can cause rifts. Or even atheists, like Kyle and Shayna. But I just thought it was really interesting to put that under a list of taboo topics because it seemed very European Enlightenment to me. Particularly the idea of, religion isn't important enough. Whereas for many people in the world, religion would be top of the list of things to talk about on a first date. Or not necessarily talk about, but to know about your partner.
Yeah, to ask, that you would have...
Yeah, because you would want to marry someone of your faith, or you would want to marry somebody with a similar worldview, for example. It was... this is what I find quite interesting about the show in general, of course, is the idea of etiquette is something that is not really cross-transferable anyway. You've got British etiquette, and that's fine. But British etiquette isn't necessarily going to fly in Japan, for example.
Yeah.
And vice versa. And, sure, it's a British... I'm not trying to rag on Help by Sexting My Boss. I think it's a very fun show, and I think the two guys who host it do a great job. But I couldn't help but put on my Scholar of Religion cap and think about that little taboo list. Because... to me, it just seems like something that would obviously be discussed. For us, of course it would, maybe in a different light to other people, because our interest in religion is different to... He clearly didn't put that on a list of taboo list, as in, don't talk about religion if you study it.
Well, yeah.
He wanted you to avoid having a McGrath and Dawkins-style debate at the dinner table.
When I find it, because I'm deep in Love Island territory, as it is Love Island season. And what I have found really interesting is I don't think, at least in Love Island UK, I can't speak for the other offshoots, I don't think I've ever seen a conversation about religion on that show. And I don't know whether they have those conversations and they're edited out, which would be really fascinating. And if they never have those conversations, that's also fascinating. Like, there's something really interesting about the lack of discussion about it. I think there might have been someone on Love Island USA or something that mentioned having someone who believed in God was really important to them, but I don't remember it being a thing. I think it was just a thing they said in their, opening, I'm a sexy lady kind of conversation, and then never was really brought up again.
Yeah, and I guess maybe it has been discussed, and TV networks are a bit apprehensive about it, because I remember years ago, I don't know if this is still the case, but I found out that Ofcom's reports. So for non-UK listeners, Ofcom is the regulation body for TV standards, and they're the ones who receive the complaints. According to Ofcom reports and their list of most offensive words, in other words, words that got the most complaints, above the F word and the C word, at the very top of offensive words that drew complaints, was Jesus or Christ.
Huh.
And this wasn't that long ago. I think I was in school at the time, so you're talking in the 2000s. And I think I found out because the BBC had a show, maybe they still do, I don't watch the BBC as much as I used to, called Points of View, which is where disgruntled BBC viewers would write in every week complaining about the shows. And the BBC would, for some reason, air those complaints. They would also air praise as well, and it was hosted by Terry Wogan, and Terry Wogan would say, "Oh, well, I'm very sorry that you were disappointed in the programme." But I think it was through conversations related to Points of View that I found out that, yeah, Jesus or Christ, in a blasphemous, saying the Lord's name in vain sense, draws more complaints in the UK than the C word or the F word. Maybe that's changed in recent years, although I wouldn't be surprised if it hasn't.
Well, now I'm going to do some research tonight.
Yeah. That only just came back to me.
That would be interesting. But yeah, that would... I just, the world of dating is weird. It's just weird. I'm glad I'm not dating anymore.
Yeah. And so it is interesting.
Not that I ever did that much of it anyway.
Maybe the idea of religion being taboo and the Help I Sexted My Boss moment was kind of the opposite, I felt, of the Love is Blind episode, where religion was just on the table all the time being discussed, whereas here it was almost like they were saying, well, look at what happened to Kyle and Shayna. It was a bit of a disaster, wasn't it? You know, you want your first date to go well. So I found it very interesting, I have to say. And I was going somewhere with this, but I've lost my thread.
Was it a weird segue into the episode topic, or?
The episode topic, yes, let's do that. Well, something else that's also on TV is Star Trek. Have you heard of Star Trek?
I have. Oh, I did want to say, so this is another episode deep dive into a Star Trek episode. And lovely Star Wars fans that are our listeners, I am aware that this is the second Star Trek episode we are doing, and we have yet to do any Star Wars other than our commentary on Jediism in our Invented Religions episode last season.
Yes. And to that we say, deal with it.
To that I say, I am working on it. I want to do something, but unfortunately I feel like Star Wars, it's like you either talk about Jediism or like, what else are you going to talk about? Because it's so everywhere. Everything about Star Wars you can talk about religion because of the Force. And stuff like that.
Yeah, and you could do Christ figures and stuff like that, which I feel has been done to death.
Yeah. So I want to find an interesting angle on it, and unfortunately, I think the most interesting angle I already did a video essay on. But I guess we could always revisit it with your opinions on it as well. So I'm working on it. It will probably be a Clone Wars episode because that way it's a shorter thing to watch, because I don't have a lot of time to take notes on a 3-hour movie. I'm sorry. So, it'll probably be a Clone Wars episode.
The new film's 3 hours.
Oh, I don't know. They're all aren't all the, like, movies that come out. I'm trying not to swear on this podcast, but,
we are professionals.
Like, aren't all movies that come out these days, like, 3 to 4 hours long?
They are. Yeah, they are. I think cinema is becoming increasingly ill-disciplined, but that's a whole other conversation. Yeah, we will come to Star Wars. It's just that Star Trek is better, so we're doing that.
It's just
first.
that Alan knows Star Trek very well, and therefore will send me messages saying we're doing a Star Trek episode, and I haven't gotten around to doing Star Wars. So it is on me. As
listeners can probably tell, I'm the Trekkie, but at the same time, I do like Star Wars. I'm not one of those people who is either or. Star Wars is very cool.
So if you want to watch along with us, I say watch along, we're not like watching the show and pausing it or anything, although we could do that. But it's Star Trek, the original series, season 2, episode 2, called something about Adonis. I don't remember. I didn't write down the
Who
title.
mourns for Adonis?
Who mourns for Adonis? So if pause this episode, go watch it, come back. We're talking about it.
Yes, we are. And there's a number of interesting things about this particular episode. So we've already, as Vivian mentioned, we've already done an episode on Star Trek, but that was on Star Trek The Next Generation. So I feel like we don't really need to introduce what Star Trek is. Everyone knows what Star Trek is, surely. But there's a couple of things that are worth repeating about Star Trek. And the first thing that's very interesting about Star Trek is that it presents a utopia vision, but more specifically, a socialist utopia. Star Trek envisages a beautiful future. In case you can't tell what my political leanings are. No, Star Trek presents a future wherein capitalism has collapsed and humanity itself was on the brink of destruction. There is a Third World War in Star Trek lore that humanity was able to recover from, and it's through technology that humanity was able to find salvation, in inverted commas. It is technology that allowed them to end world hunger with food replicators. It is technology that allowed them to avoid the need for money or currency in the Star Trek universe. People work in the Star Trek universe for the sake of working, for the improvement of society, because they want to. You just do it because you want to. And why wouldn't you when your job could be working on the Enterprise? That would just be so cool. And there is an episode of The Next Generation where, I think you've seen this one, Vivian, where they defrost some rich people from the 20th century who had cryogenically frozen themselves. And one of them is like a Wall Street banker. And he gets really agitated with Picard when he finds out that his wealth and everything has just disappeared, that money just isn't a thing. And he says to Picard, well, what's the point? What's the point of doing anything? And Picard says, the point is to improve yourself, to enjoy it. And I just think that's absolutely wonderful, because I've said this a million times to you, Vivian, that if I won the lottery tomorrow and money was just no object to me, I'd just get a house in the middle of nowhere and I would just write. Just for the enjoyment of writing, and email it into the void and wait for the books to come out and live my own little Star Trek utopia. As an obscenely rich person, I know. But that's worth mentioning with Star Trek for one point. And the second point is the humanist side of Star Trek. So Gene Roddenberry, who created the Star Trek series, was a humanist, and his humanism fed into the storylines of Star Trek quite a bit. Now, it was when Next Gen came along that you really saw his socialism and his humanism, because he had a little more control over things. Star Trek was really well established at this point. You know, the movies had been blockbuster hits as well. So Star Trek Next Gen could get a little bit preachy at times. You know, people thought it was being preachy, but because it had a lot of it aligned with my worldview, I'm like, yeah. So maybe it's not so preachy to me when Riker tells someone off for eating animals. But so the original series is a little bit more all over the shop. It is a utopia. It is based in our future, and it is a world wherein humanity has been liberated by technology. But there were a lot of different writers on the original series of Star Trek, and that's why sometimes things don't align quite so well. And this particular episode that we're discussing today was not written by Gene Roddenberry, and that's not surprising given some of the things some of the characters say in this episode, particularly relating to the existence of God. So, to set the scene, Kirk and the Enterprise are boldly going when no one's gone before, and they are essentially stopped in the middle of their journey by a god. And the god is Apollo from Greek mythology. And he very kindly, he invites members of the crew down to the planet. He just beams them down himself. And so happy is Apollo to be reunited with humans that he tells them that they are to stay there and they are to worship him and to love him, and he'll give them everything that they want. Kirk is obviously not very happy about this. Nobody tells Kirk what to do, even Apollo. And as is tradition in a original series episode of Star Trek, Kirk ends up yelling at an alien and having many arguments with it, because from the Enterprise's point of view, they have outgrown the need for worshipping deities. They don't rely on the support that a belief in a deity will have, and they also believe that they have their own freedom. They should be able to go and explore the galaxy, go back home. They feel that they are being kept prisoners by Apollo. From Apollo's perspective, he hasn't actually encountered humans in a long time, and what we discover through the course of the episode is that the gods from Greek mythology were real. They were aliens. They were aliens that visited Earth that were interpreted by society to be gods. But they were not deities, they were just aliens with great powers. Well, discuss. Maybe that is a deity. But that's the way that this episode frames it. After a while, Kirk and the Enterprise and his crew realise that Apollo is essentially thriving on the love of humans. And he was part of a group of Greek gods, but a group of travelling aliens who also thrived on the lives of on the love of humans, who have now passed on, presumably because humans have moved beyond the need for deities. Again, you're seeing this humanist future of Star Trek. When I say I love the idea of the future of Star Trek, I mean politically in terms of socialism. I think its idea of humanism as a broad blanket sheet is very problematic, so please don't think
and
that
we
that's
might
what I
get
mean.
into that.
Even though I am a humanist as an individual, I don't think that a wonderful utopia would involve everyone being humanism. That does involve erasing a lot of identities and so forth. Parking that to one side for a moment. The episode ends like it usually ends. The Enterprise blows something up. In this case, they blow up Apollo's energy source, and he kind of fades away, being all upset that Kirk and the Enterprise didn't love him. And throughout this episode as well, there's some horrendous sexism.
Well,
It's really problematic as well. But that is the gist of the episode. The gist of the episode is, for me, there are two prongs to this episode. The first prong is that the Greek gods were aliens, and isn't it a really interesting idea that aliens were interpreted as deities? And the second prong is that humanity, according to Star Trek, has avoided the need, or not avoided the need, has evolved beyond. And again, using these terms in a very Tylorian sense, it's not an endorsement, but I feel like Tylor's coming up quite a lot recently. But would you say you could see seeds of Tylor's ideas here as well?
Yeah, and I think we've talked a bit about this, that I think E.B Tylor has had a lot of impact on pop culture because of the fact that in like the 1850s or whatever, when his books were starting to come out, he was quite popular outside of academia. It wasn't just academics that really read him like a lot of academic work is done now. But he was kind of like the Joseph Campbell. Oh, no, I'm sure plenty of people read our monographs. But, like, I know that, like, Joseph Campbell, for example, although he was writing, not now, but, like, in the 60s or whatever, he was really popular with people outside of academia. I think Tylor, every once in a while there's an academic that pops up that everyone reads and is kind of seen as the accessible everyman's academic. And I think Tylor was that in his day, and because of that, he's really impacted the way a lot of people learned to view religion. And I know that was like in the 1850s and stuff, but that has really, cemented itself in understandings of religion and of society and of how things work. And I think we've talked a lot about how much we disagree with Tylor, so I won't get too into it, but do know that we do disagree with this viewpoint quite a lot for many reasons.
Yes.
The least of which is, well, I guess the most of which is the racism that is embedded in the system of its understanding. And that will come up today as we talk about it, because there was a lot of that, although we're talking about Greece in this conversation rather than other cultures that are more colored, the viewpoint is still tainted with that Tylorian idea of the primitive. They talk a lot about, these old shepherds that didn't know any better because they were just these old shepherds in this primitive. They never used the word primitive. I did keep an eye out for it.
Oh, it is heavily implied.
It is basically that. If you're hearing anything weird from Alad's side, he is currently wrestling with a cat. So
unbelievable. He is so rude.
But we are doing our best to keep powering through despite the cat interruptions. But I find there was a lot of Tylorian idea of myth as well, which I particularly distaste. Although strangely also very not Tylor at the same time. And I find that really fascinating, and it really showed how they didn't quite have one cohesive idea of mythology.
No, not at all. And I find this interesting about Star Trek in general, that the way religion is handled in Star Trek is, on the one hand, you have this Tylorian idea of, let's call them the Earth religions. So, or, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and so on. They don't really get discussed in Star Trek. But other cultures on other planets are very religious. The Vulcans, for example, and the Vulcans aren't presented as being quote-unquote primitive at all. The Vulcans are actually presented as being a very advanced race. And the Vulcans are incredibly religious. They have rituals, they have mysticism, they have esoteric practices. So much of it is influenced by ideas of religion, but it's not Earth religion, it's future space religion, and therefore not primitive. Do you see where I'm coming from here? So there's these two things going along at the same time, that Earth seems to be quite humanist, and they do say that in certain episodes of later Star Trek in particular, when they really started to think about, okay, what is the world of Star Trek? Whereas when the original series started out, it was a weekly sci-fi show that didn't have this heritage and so on. And there is a mention of people being free to practice whatever faith they want and so on. But as we discussed in the last episode we did on Star Trek, Picard essentially describes the future to a quasi-Vulcan race as being humanist. He says that one day you will move beyond believing in gods, and then you'll have space travel and so forth, because they see it as a negative that they don't just see it as a negative that this society believes that Picard is a god. They do see it as a negative that this society has started believing in a god in general, just as it has started the shift to atheism. That Tylorian idea of, well, you begin with your polytheism and then you evolve to monotheism, and then eventually the goal is scientific reason and atheism. So you can see those ideas playing out in Star Trek there. But, I beg your pardon. But at the same time, the other alien species in Star Trek have very religious angles, and they're not really presented as well, sometimes they are, like that episode that we were just discussing, but it's often not necessarily a critique of religion. It's more of a gateway of just talking about different issues and things like that, and that's stuff that Star Trek does really well. So, to clarify, because I'm really worried about being misunderstood here, when I speak about how beautiful the future of Star Trek is, and it can be very beautiful, I mean in terms of a world where people live for the sake of enjoyment and knowledge and the eradication of capitalism, I do think it's worrying that there's an idea that everyone is all of a sudden humanist. Because what on earth does that even mean?
Yeah.
It's very much it's very much a white liberal guy's view of the future in that sense of, oh yeah, well, everything's fine because they'll all be woke.
Yeah, it's all very me. I don't see color kind of mentality.
Yes, exactly.
For people who don't know, the reason why that statement is problematic is because you're erasing the cultural impact and experience of what it means to be someone of color. And by saying I don't see it. And that's kind of what's happening a lot in Star Trek, is that kind of erasure of the cultural identity marks that makes, to me, that's what makes people so beautiful and amazing and fascinating to study, are these inherent differences between us and the way that these cultural and identity marks make people who on the surface may seem exactly the same so inherently different.
And then oddly, that's what Star Trek does so well with the worlds that they explore and so on. That is one of the wonderful things about Star Trek, is how sometimes it can provide social commentary on contemporary issues. And you do explore modern debates and so forth, and different kinds of people through the characters that the crew of the Enterprise will meet. And in that sense, it's almost like a show that celebrates multiculturalism. It's just then quite strange that their vision of Earth and itself is so humanist. And as an academic, I don't really like to talk about my own worldviews because, as I often say to my students, in terms of the study of religions, we adopt a methodological agnosticism anyway. I tend to not share where I stand. And I don't think I have on this podcast either. But the reason I mentioned today that I am humanist is because even though there is a humanist vision in Star Trek, I still find that problematic. That's not my humanism, if that makes sense. And I think also I'm trying to make a point here about lived religion as well, and different interpretations. That when I say I'm a humanist, I don't envisage a future wherein, oh, well, everyone will be like me. That's certainly not what I see.
Now, in regards to this episode, I am going to try to not have too huge of a feminist rant about the very, very overt misogyny that is happening in this episode. However, I am going to mention the fact that there is a character on this episode who is the archaeologist / anthropologist / ancient civilization specialist, which also, by the way, the fact that all three of those things are in one person is already a massive misunderstanding of how we work.
No, she's interdisciplinary. She clearly, when she applied for a job on the Enterprise, she wrote on her application that she adopts interdisciplinary methods that draws from archaeology, anthropology, and ancient civilization studies.
But she's supposed to be a myth specialist. And there were times that I really liked her and times that I really didn't. But one of the things that I thought was really funny, and this is just a side note, is they're at this temple, they're talking about trying to figure out what's going on, and Kirk turns to her and says, "Tell me what you know about Apollo." And she says 2 sentences, and I was like, if you grabbed me on my specialism and said, "Tell me about this generic thing," you would not get me to shut up. The fact that this person said 2 sentences, I was like, who are you? You are not a specialist.
Yeah.
But also, another little fun note was Apollo decides to switch her outfit at one point, because he says that you need to have your bow arm bare, and changes her outfit to supposedly do that. And I looked at that and I said, I cannot imagine shooting a bow in that outfit. And I shoot a bow.
It doesn't look like the most aerodynamic. Yeah, it doesn't look like the most aerodynamic.
It looks like my bowstring will get tangled up in my sleeve and it will just make everything go wrong. I don't know how I'm supposed to shoot a bow in that outfit.
Yeah. And I think it's important to mention her as well, because she is a crucial part of the story, because this is where the sexism becomes even more problematic, because Apollo falls in love with her and vice versa. And she essentially becomes a barrier between Kirk and the destruction of Apollo. Kirk wants to he doesn't want to destroy Apollo, but that's the only option. He wants to stop Apollo, and because I believe her name's Carolyn, because Carolyn has fallen for Apollo, she becomes a barrier. She isn't willing to help, and it becomes a struggle to help. And it's, I know it's made in the 1960s, but it really presents it as, because she has fallen for the charms of the absolute stud that is Apollo, then her womanly mind is now irrational and therefore can't see the bigger picture. All she cares about is being in it. Do you see?
And
that's definitely what they were trying to present.
I will do my slight rant here, which is the fact that
you go ahead.
They spend so much time talking about these. They do not use the word, but I will, primitive shepherds in ancient Greece who were so silly to fall for the fact that this guy is a god when really he's not a god. He's just the superior being of some other form, which that's a whole nother conversation. But aren't they so silly?
Yes.
And then this woman is believing he is a god and kind of saying, yeah, sure, why not? Why not chill here and be with this guy? And isn't it so much like women to be just as primitive in thought as these old people from before? Which is that thing of, it's like, it's already problematic to be thinking of these ancient civilizations as primitive and silly in thought and not as enlightened and reasonable as you are. And now you're gonna say the same thing about women, which again is very Tylorian, and the fact that women are so unable to think as rationally as men, and I just wanted to strangle somebody when I was watching the episode, because at the very beginning, when she first was like, yeah, sure, I'll go off with you and talk to you, why not? I was like, oh yeah, I would do the same thing, because I would be sitting there going, yeah, I study myths, you're saying you're Apollo, why would I not sit and talk to you? This would be
You're sitting there
amazing.
Thinking, this would be a brilliant peer-reviewed article.
I'm sitting there going, of course, this would be an amazing study. And there's at the near the end of the episode, when she decides to, there's a whole speech that Kirk gives her, which is basically, you're supposed to breed, which is another issue that I have, but that's going to be on the back burner of a different episode where I go on feminist rants more. But after doing this speech, she decides she's going to cut off all ties with Apollo. And the way she does it is by saying that he's basically the thing that she's studying, which is how I would have viewed it. But what I found really fascinating, this kind of ties a little bit to our previous Star Trek episode, is they make it sound like you can't love the people you study. And you know, she kind of says it as like, oh yeah, why I can't love you because it would be like a scientist loving a bacteria, or she says something along those lines. And I was like, I didn't write that bit. I wrote a lot of quotes down. I did not write that one down. But it was one of those things where I went, but it's not the same, because this is a person. They might not be human, but they're a person. And you are studying people. And as someone who studies people, I love the people who I study. And I feel connections for them. And I don't always like them, but I always have a deep love for them. And I think that it goes back to what we were kind of saying in that previous episode of the way that people see that social scientific research needs to be as separated as, say, the normal, biology kind of scientists studying bacteria. But I also think maybe they can also love what they study and love it. It might be slightly different in a different way, but I also know a lot of anthropologists who end up marrying people from the communities that they have studied and lived with, because they're there and they're living there and they're experiencing this culture and they understand it and they form these connections. And I found that a really fascinating view into the way they see social scientific research.
The humanities and the social sciences can be inherently personal. And it's one of the reasons why I do let my students know that seminar discussions and so forth are a safe space. Because so many of the issues we discuss in the study of religions and in the social sciences can be inherently personal to people. They can there isn't always that clean break between you and what you're studying, because what Karen was essentially saying to Apollo is that you're what I'm studying. There is a complete separation between us. We are two separate binaries. I once was at a event, an ISKCON event, and a member of ISKCON said to me that when they meet academics, they feel like the specimen. That was the phrase they used. They feel like the specimen because scholars are essentially looking at them as if they're under a microscope. And that isn't how we should want our... I was going to say our subject, and that also makes it feel specimen. But that isn't how we want the people that we study to feel. Because at the end of the day, we can talk about the insider or outsider debate, and, we no doubt will talk about the insider and outsider debate, because I do love the insider-outsider debate. I do find it interesting. But we are... I do find it really interesting. But we are all essentially insiders in the sense that we are human. And there isn't that clear-cut distinction between us as though we were studying bacteria, as Carolyn told Apollo. And we shouldn't be seeing someone as the specimen, like the lovely member of ISKCON told me. That rather we are part of what we're studying as well. And we've touched on this previously, particularly the episode where we discussed fieldwork and your experience at CoxCon. That your role as a researcher impacts the people around you, and it impacts you as well. You can feel different things, and you can be moved by experiences in your fieldwork in ways that you weren't expected to, and that can impact your work as well. So you are part of the research as much as the subject themselves.
Yep.
I'm using the word subject very loosely.
So, should we talk about their view of gods in this? Because I think this is the big thing to unpack here. So yes. I as I was watching this episode, it's hot and summer here in the UK, so I had all my windows open, and I live by a train line, as I'm sure many of you have heard throughout the many episodes of hearing trains go past. So when the windows are open, it's even louder, and so I had subtitles on, which meant that it was also very easy to take down exact quotes. So,
good. Because you've got the quotes that I want to discuss.
So I wrote down many, many quotes, but I figured what would be interesting is to maybe start with the Kirk statements about gods, and then maybe end with the more world building idea of gods, if that makes sense. Like the way they came to understand how this god came to be in ancient Greece. Is that the right order of doing things in? Okay.
I would say so, yes.
So, near the beginning, I have gods as having, quote, just a bag of tricks. Kirk is talking to Apollo, and he says, we're not going to call you a god just because you have a bag of tricks, or something along those lines. And I just went, okay.
So is Kirk saying there that Apollo has bags of tricks, not gods? So is he saying that Apollo is masquerading as a god because he has this bag of tricks?
So I think this was at the beginning when Kirk wasn't convinced that he was actually Apollo yet. So this was when he was saying you're masquerading as a god because you have a bag of tricks. But essentially equating it a little bit of the way he's acting and controlling things is equivalent to God. but it's just tricks, which part of me wants to be like, this is more along those lines. Now this is a quote that you referenced already. And I wrote down this quote exact. I paused it, rewound, made sure that I got it word for word, because there's 2 sentences here and they contradict each other. So the quote is, "Mankind has no need of gods. We find the one quite adequate."
There's so much to unpack there, isn't there?
Done the whole episode on just this one quote, because it's like,
yeah,
what?
I love that line. I love that line, or those lines, in a, what on earth is being said there? Because, yeah, you're right, there's a contradiction here. Firstly, he's pointing towards an atheistic society, a Tylorian society, where they've outgrown the need for religion and deities. But, on the other hand, it's then a very Christocentric idea of, oh, well, we've got our one God, and he is clearly, okay, he doesn't express it, but he is clearly referring to the Christian gods here. There is no doubt in my mind that this is what he is referring to. And I guess that's almost quite Tylorian in itself as well, that there's this progression from polytheism to monotheism, that as society becomes more quote-unquote sophisticated, monotheism is then the last step. So Christianity then is the last step for European Western society in particular, before moving on to atheism. But yes, both are happening there. And I think, what on earth is happening here? And this is why I mentioned Roddenberry's humanism right at the beginning, and his atheism, and the fact that these early Star Trek episodes were still written by a range of sci-fi writers, popular sci-fi writers as well, from the 50s and the 60s. And there you can see someone else's influence coming, and because that is not a Roddenberry line.
Yeah, but
but don't get me wrong, I don't put Roddenberry on a pedestal.
What's weird is that first sentence feels like a Roddenberry line. The second sentence does not.
Yes.
It feels like it was written by 2 completely different people, because it's like you say, they're, in one hand, they're saying, we don't need any gods. That's literally basic. Have no need of gods. Any. That's no need of any gods. But the second line is, we find the one adequate, which means, oh, so you have a need for a god, because you have one.
Or, and I don't think this is the case, I'm just trying to think of it, maybe they've worded it poorly, that they're saying we don't have a need for polytheism, we've already found the real deal.
Potentially.
I don't think that is the case. I'm just trying to think, did they just write a really clunky
I mean, potentially.
line?
It's not like this whole thing was immensely well written, but...
No, it's a clunky episode at best. So perhaps that was the case. But that is just so interesting, because that's never revisited. Kirk's never described as being Christian, for example. He never then comes back to this idea of one God. And incidentally, this reminds me that in Star Trek V, which was written and directed by Shatner, and you will find out why in a moment. Find out why that's obvious in a moment. That also ends with a god attempting to take control of the Enterprise. And Kirk basically defeats the god by shouting at it. Because he says to the god, well, what does a god need with the starship? And then it turns out to be the exact same plot, that this is just an immensely powerful alien pretending to be a deity. And the reason why it's so obvious that this was written and directed by Shatner is that in the original script, Kirk has a fight with Jesus on the bridge of the Enterprise. A fist fight. And wins. But, yeah, the films certainly did retread some of the old stories quite a bit. So they came back to this idea of a powerful alien masquerading as a deity that Kirk once again defeats by yelling at it. Then again, Star Trek V isn't one of the best films, so don't put too much stock in that.
So I think that the more the view of gods that the show is having is this kind of complicated conception of mythology and anyway, but basically,
yeah, it's almost as if the
go ahead.
Sorry, go on. I was going to say that to me, like in very crude terms, there just seems to be, well, mythology is clearly fake because it's myth, whereas contemporary monotheism is real because it's there in everyday life. People go to church on Sundays, and not that I'm saying that myths aren't there in real everyday life. Again, I'm just giving a crude perception of what's being presented here, that myths are stories, whereas monotheism is real and the gospel is real.
Yeah. Well, they even say at one point,
it's the problem with the word myth, isn't it?
They say at one point, mythology has a basis in fact. So trying to say that, like, oh, well, this would make sense that an alien came down to Earth and landed in ancient Greece, and then people just kind of took him, because obviously that could be where it comes from, because all of these stories would have some kind of basis in fact, which is a really interesting take, that you can't see fact in a different way. And this is a conversation that I have a lot with students in mythology, that the idea of truth is a very complicated conception and can have multiple different viewpoints and multiple different understandings.
Just speak to the Conservative government.
But yeah.
Sorry, my bit of satire.
So you can have truth in the sense of what they mean it as when they say this fact of there historically is this guy called Apollo who showed up and that people worshipped as a god. But you can have truth in a different meaning, which is that you are teaching social and cultural truths through your stories. And it doesn't matter whether or not Apollo is real. That's not the point. The point is what the story of Apollo is teaching you. And then you can have other viewpoints of truth, which is that it is pointing more towards conceptions of the way that cultures structure their thought. So it's not even that the moral of the story is type truth. It's the way that the stories are constructed that point to the way that we categorize the world. And that is the inherent truth of a myth that you have to kind of dig into to get to. And these are all different aspects of truth. And they decided to pick this very historical conception of it.
Yes.
Which is
fact or fiction.
Which is such a, as we've been talking about, it's such a Tylor had a very different view of myth. So I don't remember if we've talked about this in our previous, we had an episode on myth, back in I think it was one of our very first episodes we did together when we did,
yes, it was a while ago,
Legend of Zelda and mythology. And I don't remember if I talked about Tylor in that sense, but Tylor had the idea that myth is an explanation for the world. So in this sense, it's why is there lightning? Well, it's because of Thor. That's what he means. And I don't know whether this idea of the god comes down would fit that idea. 'Cause
dreams were also a big part of Tylor's ideas as well, weren't they? Religion as an explanation for dreams.
Yeah, I think he had a bit of weird separation between myth and religion, but also inherently connected because he was of the ritual myth thing. But I think that he thought that myths... Oh, I'm trying to remember the order. Tylor and Fraser are very similar, but the order that they understand myth and ritual is flipped. So one of them believed that myth came first and then that created ritual, and the other one believes that ritual came first and then the myths came to explain the ritual. And I don't remember which one Tylor is, if I'm honest. I should have relooked this up.
I'm not going to go on record on this either, so don't worry.
Yeah, so Tylor, his idea of the myth, or the dreams, was connected to animism and the idea of the spirit, and we had to have an explanation for the difference between sleep and dead, which, again, I really don't like Tylor. And his very simplistic understanding of how humans work. But yeah, so I thought this was really interesting. And they also kind of get into when I find a very typical understanding of how gods work in sci-fi and fantasy. And outside of that, there's some I was going to say real world religions, but you know what I mean. Non-fictional religions that would see it similarly of a god cannot survive without worshippers, that's kind of what gives them the power. Is you as a worshipper are part of the cyclical nature of their power, as you give them power through worship. And this is something that you see in American Gods, for example, by Neil Gaiman. He in that one, it was all about the gods that are given power. And like this one, Neil Gaiman had the same idea of these old mythological gods are fading and aren't powerful anymore because no one is worshiping them. And I find this such a glaring misunderstanding of contemporary mythology and contemporary religion. There are a lot of people who still worship the old gods. A lot of people. In fact, there's a huge movement of reconstructing pre-Christian religions and trying to replicate the way that they used to be. There is a huge amount of it here in the UK. There's a huge amount of it in Iceland. There's a huge amount of it in Greece. There's a huge amount of it in Italy. They're all over the place of people. It's often tied to nationalism as well, of trying to get back to what it means to be Greek, is, you know, these pre-Christian conceptions of mythological polytheistic religions and returning to them. So there are a lot of people that currently exist that worship Apollo.
Yes, and I think also what's playing a part here is the world religions paradigm, which I know isn't a term that's really in, you know, everyday vernacular outside of the study of religions, but the concept of the world religions paradigm hugely influences everyday understandings of religion, particularly because it's essentially informed by Christocentric understandings of religion. So the idea of old gods like Apollo and so forth, these old mythical gods disappearing because no one was worshipping them anymore, is informed by the dominance of the world religions paradigm, because the world religions paradigm is telling people that actually there are only just 6 religions anyway, and the most classical type of religion is Christianity and monotheism. So the idea of polytheism and older gods, so to speak, are falling by the wayside. And this is why I sometimes do get on my high horse about the world religions paradigm, because I think it is so... It hasn't just dominated the academy, I think it is dominating the public sphere as well. And particularly in the UK, of course, because learning about religion is compulsory in schools. And it is so informed in British schools by the world religions paradigm that everyone in the UK is going through an education system and receiving this particular idea of what religions are, and then I'm coming out on the other side of education, and therefore the world religions paradigm has had really good promotion. You know what you were saying about how Tylor was very popular with non-academic audiences and so on. Well, the world religions paradigm has a great promoter in religious education. And this isn't me ragging on religious education. Religious education is going through a huge shift at the moment anyway to modernise the subject.
And as we've said before, RE teachers are amazing, but they have to follow the curriculum that they're given, and there's not a lot of power 100%. That they have, and we definitely feel for you, our lovely RE teachers.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I've trained as an RE teacher in the past. I've worked as an RE teacher, and the curriculum or the syllabus that you are given can be hugely stifling at times. And I tip my hat off to the RE teachers who are working with it in very interesting and creative ways to circumvent those restrictions, which is really neat. But while RE's going through that shift now, it's had decades of that. I passed through the education system in the UK with the world religions paradigm. I went to university thinking of religions as being this core batch of 5 or 6 religions, and then obviously when I then started my religious studies degree, I discovered that actually this is an entirely different discipline to what I thought it was going to be, and then I led on the trajectory that I'm on now. I think one of the reasons why I found new religious movements so instantly engaging as an undergraduate was because it was so jarring and surprising to me based on what I'd had as an RE student in school up until that point. I think that's why it made that connection with me. So this idea of old gods not being worshipped anymore, to me it just screams dominance of this specific understanding of religion.
I remember thinking that particularly when I was reading American Gods, which I didn't finish. I appreciate what Neil Gaiman does. I'm not a big Neil Gaiman fan. And I like him as a person, I should specify. He seems like a really cool person.
He's a rad guy.
I just cannot get into his work. But when I was reading American Gods, and like the big figure of the old gods that is really fading and talking about how no one's worshipping it anymore is Odin. And it's like, you mean the guy that like tens of thousands of people are worshipping right now? Like, like the All-Father is like, of all the old gods, it's gonna be him that everyone's kind of going to, like, more than Apollo, so anyway, that always annoyed me. But yeah, I found this idea really fascinating in the sense that it really showed, like you said, that preconceived conception of how gods work, and B, how that is therefore failing, because why would people return to a religion like that when we have progressed to the enlightenment that is atheism and scientific rationality? Yes. Why would people who have, in the 21st century, why would people go back to that kind of understanding of religion? And there's a lot of people going back to it for a multitude of reasons, some of which is very political and some of which is not. And those are really important conceptions to realize is happening, and it really shows how much they just did not know what's going on. And to be honest, didn't even really realize a lot of how just belief in religion works, but that's what we can say about a lot of pop culture, isn't it? And of course,
lack of belief in religion as well, because religion is so often framed in popular culture. I don't just mean in Star Trek here, but as belief, and specifically belief in either a deity or an afterlife. That's often what it comes down to in pop culture, which I know is very simplistic. And Star Trek pushes beyond that in really interesting and creative ways, but it's always with fictional alien religions, not real world. Now I'm doing it as well. Real world religions.
Every time we say real, imagine air quotes.
Yeah, exactly, because what is real? Well,
yeah, well, I'm if you are interested in a feminist rants, then let us know, because maybe we can, if we ever start a Patreon, we could always have a separate bonus episode of Vivian goes on a feminist rampage about whatever it was that we watched.
I think in every episode we've done now, or most episodes we've done, there's been a moment where you've said, I could go into a feminist rant here, but I won't. You should collect each of those moments, and then we'll do a bumper episode where you revisit each episode and give us the feminist rant that you wanted to give.
Well, okay, so to be fair, so Ala did warn me about this before I sat down to watch it, and you told me about a scene where the Carolyn, the woman, is on the board, and they make a comment about, oh, isn't it a shame that she's just going to get married and have children and therefore not be working anymore here, and how terrible that is. I did not realize that is the very first scene.
Oh yeah, that's as soon as she turns up.
You start the episode with that scene, and not only is it starting the episode with that scene, but that conversation is prefaced by people very awkwardly coming onto her in the workplace, and one of them forcing her out to a coffee date because he is a senior officer pressuring her to do this.
Yes, wasn't that Scotty? I think oh gosh.
It was just one of those things where I was like, oh my god,
Yeah,
is this,
that's
I'm
bad.
3 minutes in. So if you
Yeah.
are going to watch this
There's
episode...
a few moments like that involving Scotty as well.
If you were going to watch this episode after our conversation of it, do be aware of the intensity
But we're
of
not
it.
endorsing those aspects. Yes, absolutely.
Anyway,
So,
Yeah.
Vivian, if people want to find you online in various places to hear your feminist rants, where should they go?
you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I am at Vivian Asimos in both locations. And you can check out my website, incidentalmythology.com. Also, really quick plug for two things. The podcast, this one that you're listening to right now, I have now uploaded all of our backlog episodes as well as our current ones on YouTube. So if you listen to your podcasts on YouTube, you can find them there now. So yeah, I have a channel. It's the Religion Popular Culture Podcast. So you can go and subscribe, and you can get the new podcasts as they land right there, on there if you want.
This is exciting.
I am also now doing research vlogs. So on a different YouTube channel, Vivian Asimos, I am fortnightly uploading research vlogs detailing how I'm doing research, why I'm doing certain research things, and what I'm thinking about in regards to that research. So if you want to see research as it happens and see what kind of thoughts we have and what we struggle with, and see things that I'm talking about that will probably not even end up in the final product, because that's what research is, baby, then you can come and check that out on Vivian Asimos. Sorry for all the plugs, but I just wanted to make sure I got that in there.
You plug away, Vivian.
But if
You
people
plug
want to check
away.
out what you're doing, Alan, where can they go?
They can come and find me on the Twitter sphere at AlanJ Thomas, and I should have more things to plug in a few weeks' time, so look out for that. I mean, nothing majorly exciting. Oh, yeah, I'm quite excited.
Everything is
but
exciting.
Not earth-shattering. Everything's exciting. I'm not being interviewed on Newsnight yet.
I mean, I've already been featured on BBC, so...
You have. I just need something big and Scientology related to happen in the news now. And I'll get snubbed, no doubt. Snubbed by the Beeb. But anyway, thank you for joining me, Vivian. It's always fun to talk about Star Trek. One day we will do a Star Wars episode, but until then, tough luck to you Star Wars fans. Trek rules the day. Haha.
That's a way to end the episode.
I'm joking, of course. I'm joking, of course. I have no doubt that we will discuss Star Wars very soon. Until then, take care, everyone.
Bye!
Bye-bye.